Barack Obama, universally acknowledged as the greatest orator in the history of modern American politics, a man whose sheer rhetorical command had shaped a generation and dictated the global agenda for 8 years, found himself entirely and uncharacteristically incapable of finishing a simple sentence. The massive congressional hearing room was suffocatingly thick with the kind of high-stakes, electrified tension strictly reserved for historic, legacy-defining showdowns. The stale air practically humming and vibrating under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent lights. J.D. Vance, seated firmly and immovably across the heavy expanse of the polished mahogany dais, had just read to the former president a deeply classified document penned by his own senior staff, a devastating, meticulously drafted memorandum that was explicitly designed and fiercely guarded to never see the light of day beyond the secure, heavily fortified walls of the West Wing. For the very first time in his flawlessly curated, meticulously choreographed, and relentlessly successful public life, Barack Obama was left utterly speechless, violently stripped of the impenetrable rhetorical armor that had shielded him from political ruin for decades. The silence that descended upon the chamber was not merely an absence of noise. It was a heavy physical weight pressing down on the chests of everyone present, marking the exact agonizing moment an untouchable political deity was abruptly pulled back down to earth. Mere moments earlier, before the catastrophic unraveling commenced, the former president had commenced his highly anticipated testimony with his trademark, sweeping eloquence, his famously smooth voice slipping effortlessly into that familiar, resonant register that commands a sprawling, chaotic room without the slightest need for aggressive volume. It was a voice that possessed the uncanny, almost supernatural ability to carry to the very back walls of the largest auditoriums without a hint of physical strain or desperation. He sat exactly like a gracious, untouchable, and overwhelmingly confident host, presiding over a lavish dinner party that he himself had orchestrated, leaning back into the luxurious leather of his chair with a practiced, fluid ease. One of his hands rested softly and elegantly on the polished wood of the table, while the other draped casually, almost lazily, over the arm of his chair, his entire physical weight distributed with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a statesman who had navigated treacherous, hostile rooms, exactly like this one, far more times than anyone else present in the sprawling gallery. I want to say something about what brings us here today and what brings all of us in both parties to public service in the first place. He had begun smoothly adopting the hypnotic, melodic cadence of a master musician who had spent a grueling lifetime learning precisely how to occupy a specific emotional key, knowing exactly how to pluck the invisible strings of his audience's collective conscience. We are here because we believe that government can be a force for good. That is not a partisan belief, that is an American belief, and I have spent my career imperfectly, as all of us do. He had paused right after the word "and," masterfully deploying that signature, world-famous Obama pause, a deliberate, heavily weighted, and masterfully crafted silence that acted as an open architectural door, practically inviting the entire breathless room to step through and deeply admire his sweeping, magnanimous willingness to concede human flaw. In the second row of the packed gallery, a seasoned depot, because that is simply what one inevitably did when Barack Obama paused. You leaned in, captivated, waiting for the profound wisdom that was certain to follow, trying to live up to that belief. I have always believed that an honest accounting of what we got right and what we got wrong is essential to the health of this democracy. So I welcome this conversation. Obama had concluded, projecting the absolute pinnacle of presidential grace, intellectual humility, and unassailable authority. He had just smoothly characterized his monumental, world-altering tenure as merely imperfect, a polite concession designed to disarm his critics. But sitting directly opposite him, bathed in the same harsh lighting, the Vice President of the United States possessed a meticulously curated, merciless, and completely unvarnished record of those supposed imperfections. Vance had exactly 7 of those catastrophic imperfections written down in stark black and white. 7 distinct dates, 7 verbatim, undeniable quotes. The stark, brutal reality of what actually transpired in the wake of those words, and one damning, irrefutable email originating from deep within the bowels of Obama's own administration that his closest, most trusted aides had desperately hoped would remain buried in the digital ashes of history forever. J.D. Vance remained a picture of absolute, terrifying, and unyielding stillness amidst the swirling political theater, his sleeves practically rolled up to his forearms like a laborer preparing for a grueling, deeply unpleasant physical task. His glasses rested precisely on the bridge of his nose, giving him the severe, uncompromising aura of a prosecutor preparing for the final, lethal strike in a capital murder trial. In front of him sat a neat, formidable, and dangerously thick stack of papers that he had not yet deigned to touch. His heavy hands resting flat on the mahogany table, palms pressed firmly down, entirely devoid of any nervous energy, anxious tapping, or superfluous movement. When he finally broke the heavy silence of the chamber, his voice was so unassumingly quiet, so deeply grounded, and so starkly devoid of political theatricality that the highly sensitive microphone had to actively strain and amplify to pick up the sound of his words. Mr. President, I want to start by telling you something you might not expect, Vance said, slowly looking up from his neatly stacked documents and locking his eyes directly, unflinchingly, and aggressively with Obama. This raw, unblinking directness was a profound, calculated, and deeply unsettling statement in itself. In the formidable, historically intimidating presence of Barack Obama, most political adversaries inevitably cast their gaze nervously down at the table, up at the sprawling array of aggressive camera lenses, or frantically down at their heavily annotated notes, terrified of making prolonged eye contact with a man of such immense historical gravity. But Vance held his gaze completely steady, his eyes piercing straight through the polished, impenetrable veneer of the proceedings, refusing to grant the former president an inch of psychological dominance. I voted for you in 2008, he stated plainly, the words dropping like lead weights onto the polished mahogany. Across the expansive, deeply scarred table, Obama's chin elevated by a mere defensive, almost imperceptible millimeter, and his meticulously controlled, highly expressive eyebrows shifted by a fractional, involuntary degree, micro-expressions of genuine surprise and subtle recalibration captured only by the relentless, high-definition scrutiny of the front-row television cameras broadcasting the confrontation to tens of millions of viewers across the globe. Vance continued, his voice remaining absolutely steady, entirely devoid of grandiosity, soaring rhetoric, or manufactured emotion, violently pulling the entire room away from the gilded halls of Washington, D.C., and dragging them into the forgotten Rust Belt heartland of America. I was a kid from Middletown, Ohio. My mother was in and out of rehab. My grandmother, Memo, was raising me on $11 an hour in a house with stained carpet and a screen door that didn't close. The atmosphere in the massive chamber instantly, violently tightened, the oxygen seemingly siphoned directly from the room as the deeply personal, intensely raw narrative brutally anchored the impending political confrontation in visceral, unavoidable human suffering. And you stood on a stage in Grant Park and said, "Hope and change." And I believed you, Vance said. The crushing weight of an entire betrayed forgotten generation echoing loudly and mournfully in the cavernous congressional chamber. He paused then, but it was absolutely not an Obama pause. It was not a theatrical, highly calculated, beautifully orchestrated door held open for an adoring, sycophantic audience, but rather the heavy, unvarnished, suffocating, and deeply painful pause of an exhausted man actively sifting through the crushing weight of his own shattered memories and broken faith. A lot of people in Middletown believed you. People who hadn't voted in years, people who had given up on the whole thing. You brought them back. You did that with words. He rested his hand deliberately, almost reverently, on the formidable stack of documents, transforming the physical papers into the undeniable embodiment of a broken covenant between a leader and his most vulnerable citizens. I'm here today because of the words, he declared with terrifying finality, slowly turning over the very first page to begin the clinical, merciless dissection of a legacy. The 15th of June, 2009, Vance began reading with a slow, agonizingly deliberate cadence that actively refused to mock Obama's legendary, soaring voice, but rather surgically borrowed its grand architectural framework, its spaciousness, its pregnant, dramatic pauses, its intellectual rhythm, wearing it like an ill-tailored, stolen suit that serves only to highlight every structural flaw and hidden deformity beneath the fabric. You said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. If you like your healthcare plan, you can keep your healthcare plan. He set the page down with a muted, definitive, and heavy slap against the dark wood, the sound echoing sharply like a gavel striking a block. When he spoke next, the borrowed, majestic presidential rhythm vanished instantly, completely evaporated from the room, replaced entirely by his own voice, a flat, unmusical, painfully pragmatic Middletown drone reminiscent of an exhausted, debt-ridden man coldly reading a devastating, life-altering total off a grim grocery receipt. 5 million Americans received cancellation notices. PolitiFact, not a Republican organization, not a conservative blog. PolitiFact named it the lie of the year in 2013. He smoothly, methodically, and without a single ounce of visible emotion, drew the next page from the stack, establishing a visible, inescapable, and deeply traumatic ritual. The slow extraction of the document, the stark, jarring recitation in two entirely contrasting, warring voices, and the definitive, fatal placement of the paper on the table. The sheer, terrifying transparency of this grim ritual only magnified its devastating, blunt force psychological power. By the third or fourth iteration of the cycle, the entire crowded chamber could physically feel the impending, crushing blow before a single syllable was even uttered. Yet the terrifying inevitability of the strike did absolutely nothing to soften the impact. It only deepened the laceration, tearing the wound wider. The 21st of January, 2009, your first full day in office, you said, "This will be the most transparent administration in history," Vance recited, letting the soaring, idealistic presidential words breathe and expand in the stale air of the room, allowing the sheer beauty of the promise to hang there for a fleeting second before viciously, mercilessly snapping back to his unyielding, close-quartered, and brutally bare reality. Your administration prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than every previous administration in American history combined. All of them combined. The Department of Justice secretly seized 2 months of phone records from the Associated Press. The FBI named a Fox News reporter, James Rosen, a journalist, a man whose absolute fundamental job is asking questions, a criminal co-conspirator for the simple constitutional act of asking them. In the tightly packed, hyper-vigilant press gallery, a veteran female reporter's fingers abruptly and involuntarily froze, hovering completely paralyzed above her laptop keyboard, her hands suspended midair in the highly charged, electrified space between one word and the next, utterly and physically incapable of coming down to strike the keys. Vance did not wait for the massive shockwaves to dissipate. He did not offer a single second of respite. February 2009, you said, "I will not rest until every American who wants a job can find one." The flat, relentless, uncompromising Middletown, Ohio voice returned immediately, striking the room repeatedly like a heavy industrial hammer hitting an anvil. The Armco steel plant where Memo worked, where half the town worked, where a man could graduate high school on a Friday and have a secure, dignified job with benefits on Monday, closed its absolute last production line during your presidency. Opioid prescriptions in Butler County tripled between 2009 and 2015. The good jobs left, and the bitter pills arrived, and they arrived in the exact same commercial trucks that used to carry American steel, driving on the exact same crumbling roads, delivering absolute ruin to the exact same quiet houses. He stared straight through the former president, his eyes reflecting the cold, hard reality of a graveyard. You did not rest, Mr. President. You gave a speech. Several speeches. They were beautiful. He offered the paralyzed room absolutely zero time to process the emotional shrapnel before ruthlessly, methodically turning the next page. The relentless, punishing, and utterly suffocating pace of the hearing offered no sanctuary, no quarter, and no escape, building into a terrifying, unstoppable crescendo as Vance turned yet another page, methodically exposing the sprawling, unbridgeable, and deadly chasm between soaring, historic rhetoric and brutal, blood-soaked government reality. March 2009, you said, "No more ignoring the law when it's inconvenient. That is not who we are." The delivery remained brutally deadpan, stripped of all humanity, Operation Fast and Furious. Your Justice Department deliberately, knowingly walked 2,000 lethal firearms directly across the Mexican border into the waiting hands of violent, heavily armed drug cartels in the desperate, foolish hope of tracking them. They lost track. One of those specific government-supplied guns was recovered at the bloody scene where Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was shot and killed on sovereign American soil. When the United States Congress investigated this tragedy, your Attorney General, Eric Holder, flatly refused to produce the demanded documents. You invoked executive privilege to shield him. Congress held him in criminal contempt in a fiercely bipartisan vote. Brian Terry's grieving mother still, to this very day, does not have a full, honest accounting of exactly how her son died bleeding in the dirt, and it has been over 14 agonizing years. In the tightly packed audience, an older, deeply weathered man wearing a faded, sweat-stained VFW cap pressed his trembling, scarred hand violently into his knee, his knobby knuckles turning a stark, bloodless, terrified white, his eyes wide and utterly unable to tear his gaze away from Vance's surgical, remorseless dismantling of a presidential legacy. January 2009, you said, "I will close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay." Vance delivered the devastating, irrefutable punchline in two flat, uncompromising, lethal words. "It is open." He offered absolutely no further elaboration, no contextual cushion, and no rhetorical flourishing, simply turning with machine-like precision to the next damning indictment in the towering stack. January 2009, you said, "No one in my administration will make policy based on ideology rather than evidence." The reality check hit the confined room like a massive runaway freight train completely derailing at maximum speed. The IRS, your IRS, operating under the direct authority of your hand-picked appointees, actively and maliciously targeted conservative organizations applying for standard tax-exempt status, grassroots groups with the words Tea Party, Patriot, and 9/12 inches, their innocent names were viciously singled out for crippling scrutiny endless bureaucratic delays, and deeply intrusive, unconstitutional questioning. The senior official directly responsible for this purge, Lois Lerner, was explicitly called before this very Congress. She immediately invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. She did not answer a single solitary question. Holding the final, heaviest page of this agonizing, torturous sequence, Vance finally allowed a small, deeply unconscious, and highly revealing physical gesture to slip through his rigid, ironclad composure, his thumb running repeatedly, almost neurotically, along the sharp, paper-cut edge of the document. It was the unmistakable, anxious, deeply human tell of a man heavily burdened with holding something he violently, viscerally detests, holding an artifact of profound institutional betrayal. September 2014, you said, we don't leave our people behind. That's who we are as Americans. His voice suddenly dropped to a near reverent whisper, thick and heavy with heavily suppressed righteous fury. 40 vulnerable veterans died while desperately waiting for basic medical care in Phoenix, care that was criminally scheduled on a secret, hidden waiting list, a fraudulent list the hospital aggressively maintained directly alongside the official one, so that the wait times the federal government proudly reported to the public would look significantly shorter than they actually were. A massive federal audit subsequently found 57,000 American veterans who had properly enrolled in the system, formally requested a life-saving appointment, and never, ever received one. 1,600 brave men and women waited more than 90 agonizing days. He gently, almost mournfully, set the page down, the resulting silence roaring deafeningly in the immediate aftermath. Mama's neighbors went to that specific VA, Mr. President. Honorable men who served in the freezing mud of Korea, the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, and the burning deserts of the Gulf, who came home battered and were explicitly told their great country would take care of them. They sat in sterile waiting rooms for months, staring at the walls, while the hospital actively, maliciously lied to the world about how long they'd been sitting there. He carefully, methodically, and with profound intent, aligned the 7 distinct pages perfectly on the dark wood of the table, a stark, blinding, and undeniable row of white rectangles, 7 grand historical promises anchoring the left, 7 devastating, bloody realities anchoring the right, creating a sprawling, terrifying timeline, not measured in mere calendar dates, but in the vast, agonizing, unbridgeable distance between what was confidently spoken into a microphone and what was actually done in the shadows. You said hope, Middletown got heroin. You said change, the bustling factories changed into hollow, empty buildings with overgrown weeds cracking through the asphalt in the parking lot. You said, I will not rest. Mr. President, Mama's dead neighbors are the ones who haven't rested. They've been waiting for the glorious change you promised while you were out, traversing the globe, giving beautiful speeches about it. The intense, localized gravitational pull of the entire chamber violently and abruptly shifted on its axis as Barack Obama physically leaned forward instantly and dramatically, transforming his entire posture from that of a relaxed, untouchable, aristocratic host to a fiercely cornered, hyper-alert, and highly lethal legal advocate. The entire substantial weight of his body surged aggressively toward the microphone, his famous voice plunging instantly a full half register into that commanding, historic, heavily resonant depth he traditionally summoned to remind a rebellious room exactly why the American public had overwhelmingly entrusted him with the terrifying power of the nuclear codes for 8 consecutive world-shaping years. Mr. Vice President, I appreciate your candor, and I appreciate that you shared your deeply personal story. Obama began executing a perfectly timed, flawlessly executed pause that physically almost magically drew the entire room, the hardened veteran reporter, the trembling man in the faded VFW cap, a terrified, wide-eyed Democratic staffer 2 seats to the left, forward by a collective involuntary half-inch, because that was the inescapable magnetic gravity Obama's weaponized pauses effortlessly created. Governing is hard. It is the absolute hardest thing there is, and the vast distance between a soaring campaign promise and a complex, highly negotiated policy is not a failure of individual character. It is the fundamental, inherent width of democracy itself. It is the chaotic space deeply filled with messy compromise, endless legislation, and the hard, undeniable reality that absolutely no president in the entire history of this grand republic delivers everything they passionately promise. He masterfully allowed the sweeping historical repetition to build unstoppable tidal momentum, each spoken word dropping from his lips with increasing, undeniable, and overwhelming heaviness. Not Lincoln, not Roosevelt, not Reagan, and certainly not me. But the profound question, the real enduring question, the only one history will ultimately ask, is not whether every single promise was perfectly kept. The true question is whether the overall direction was right, whether the great arc of progress was bending, however painfully, slowly, however frustratingly, imperfectly, toward true justice. He straightened his spine rigidly in his leather chair, aggressively wielding the sudden, sharp physical movement as its own formidable, nonverbal form of punctuation. And I will put my record, the 20 million vulnerable Americans who miraculously gained health insurance for the very first time in their difficult lives, the massive global economy we successfully pulled back from the terrifying edge of a second catastrophic Great Depression, the historic Iran agreement that successfully prevented a rogue nuclear weapon without the loss of a single precious American casualty. I will aggressively put that record against absolutely any administration in modern history. The heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed the words modern history lasted for 3 full, excruciating, heart-stopping seconds, a masterfully calibrated, fully loaded, and intensely lethal Obama pause that physically forced every single living soul in the cavernous room to hold their collective breath, utterly terrified of the massive, crushing weight the very next sentence would inevitably carry when it finally descended. A young, fiercely loyal Democratic staffer seated nervously behind the witness table sat perceptibly straighter, a faint glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. A paralyzed, frozen pen on the press row tentatively, cautiously started moving across a notepad once again, the natural order of the political universe seemingly attempting to reassert itself. Vance sat completely motionless, waiting with cold, predatory patience for the frantic scratching of the reporter's pen to completely stop. Mr. President, 20 million Americans got insurance, and 5 million more completely lost the plans you explicitly, repeatedly told them they could keep. Vance countered sharply, his voice cutting through the thick air like a serrated hunting knife, shattering the majestic, carefully constructed silence into 1,000 irrecoverable, jagged pieces. You are happily counting the people you helped. I am reading you the exact names of the people you lied to. The reporter's pen instantly, violently stopped moving. The hopeful Democratic staffer did not dare sit a millimeter straighter, her posture immediately collapsing back into sheer terror. I want to read you one more thing, Vance said, his voice dropping into a chilling register of lethal, uncompromising precision, signaling the arrival of the final fatal blow. With chilling, methodical execution, Vance reached deep beneath his towering stack of indictments and retrieved a single, entirely distinct page printed on entirely different, significantly heavier paper stock, boasting a distinctly different, highly classified institutional header and bearing the undeniable, catastrophic, deeply embossed blue ink of a White House memorandum seal, the exact type of highly guarded seal that appears exclusively on sensitive documents, explicitly meant to be shielded from hostile press conferences, congressional subpoenas, and public scrutiny forever. This is a deeply internal communication, originating from deep inside your White House, explicitly dated the 12th of September 2013, exactly 2 months before the disastrous healthcare.gov launch, directly sent by a senior policy advisor straight to your chief of staff. Vance announced, slowly and deliberately adjusting his glasses, preparing to read at the methodical, unrelenting, and agonizing pace of a courtroom dictation. Each individual clause arrived completely separately, set down heavily onto the dark wood table of the hearing like massive iron weights being placed on a delicate scale, one by one, each single syllable adding crushing, undeniable mass to the prosecution's ultimate case. The keep your plan language is going to be a massive problem. Internal HHS projections clearly show between 5 and 8 million individual market policyholders will definitively receive absolute cancellation notices in the very first 90 days. Vance paused, looking up from the page, his cold eyes locking onto the former president like a predator that had finally cornered its elusive prey. Between 5 and 8 million, that was the exact specific number your own senior staff gave you, Mr. President. Not a hostile Republican estimate, not a partisan right-wing think tank. Your highly paid people, your internal projections, your exact number. Vance's unblinking eyes returned to the damning, highly classified document, reading aloud the internal staff recommendation that had desperately, practically begged the president to pivot away from the looming deception before it was too late. We desperately need to either stop using the line immediately or urgently add a caveat. At bare minimum, POTUS should say most people instead of everyone. Continuing to use the current definitive language creates massive, significant legal and political exposure. He carefully, almost delicately, set the heavy memorandum aside, letting it rest beside the others, and picked up the agonizing, incredibly brief response, a single fatal placeau, the paragraph representing the all-powerful chief of staff's definitive historical reply. When Vance spoke again, his voice had gone terrifyingly, unnaturally quiet, carrying the heavy, mournful, and inescapable burden of a reluctant executioner, reading a damning absolute verdict directly to the profoundly guilty party who had ordered the crime. POTUS reviewed. He actively wants to keep the line exactly as is. It currently polls at a 78% favorability rating. The very oxygen in the massive congressional room seemed to instantly, violently evaporate, leaving the attendees gasping in a sudden, terrifying vacuum. Vance paused again, letting the suffocating, unbearable silence actively magnify the sheer devastation of the revelation before slowly reading the final, catastrophic, world-altering sentence. He said, if we caveat it, we lose the message. A deafening, apocalyptic, and profoundly horrified hush completely overtook the vast chamber. The cheap fluorescent light suspended high above the ornate dais hummed a sinister, buzzing tune that suddenly sounded deafening, and a single, cheap plastic pen rolled off the far edge of a slanted table on the press row, hitting the thick carpet with a soft, round, pitiful thud that somehow felt exactly like a loud gunshot echoing in the completely paralyzed, terrified room. Vance placed the final white rectangle down at the very end of the long row, the 8th document, the ultimate, undeniable cipher key that ruthlessly, completely explained the existence of all the others, illuminating the dark machinery of political manipulation. If we caveat it, we lose the message, Vance repeated, maintaining the exact same unrelenting, mechanical speed and utterly cold voice, actively ensuring the frantic stenographer permanently and flawlessly captured the brutal, naked reality for an official historical transcript that would outlast every single person in the room long after the blinding camera lights finally powered down. Your own trusted staff explicitly told you it was completely false, Mr. President. They did not gently hint. They did not politely suggest. They actively wrote you a highly classified memorandum with a presidential seal on it and a devastating number in it, 5 to 8 million. And they explicitly told you to stop saying it to the American people. They gave you an easy, politically viable alternative. Just say most people instead of everyone. One single word. One tiny caveat. That is absolutely all it would have taken to tell the truth. He slowly, methodically removed his glasses, deliberately placing them atop the towering stack of defeated papers, and your immediate response was not, how do we aggressively fix this problem? Your response was not, we fundamentally owe the American people the truth. Your explicit recorded response was, it polls incredibly well at 78%. Keep the line. He locked eyes with Obama, violently and permanently stripping away the absolute last remaining remnants of his presidential immunity, historical mystique, and carefully guarded legacy. You absolutely didn't misspeak, Mr. President. You didn't accidentally oversimplify a highly complicated piece of domestic policy. You were explicitly told in writing by your own chosen people in a classified document with a White House seal glowing on it that the core promise was entirely false, and you actively chose to keep making it anyway, simply because the lie tested significantly better than the truth in a sterile focus group. 5 million hardworking Americans entirely lost their essential health insurance because you cold-bloodedly decided the daily poll number was infinitely more important than the moral caveat. Beneath the heavy, shielding mahogany table, completely out of sight of the relentless broadcasting television cameras, Obama's left hand, which had been resting confidently and powerfully on the surface since the grueling hearing commenced, abruptly retreated downward to his knee, while his right hand frantically reached up to his throat to adjust his perfectly tied knot by a hurried, desperate quarter turn. It was a microscopic, barely visible, completely uncharacteristic adjustment, yet it was an undeniable, catastrophic, deeply psychological tell, because Barack Obama simply did not fidget, had absolutely never fidgeted in his entire public life, and the sudden, panicked, clutching hand on the silk tie was clearly not the composed action of a vain man simply straightening his immaculate physical appearance, but the desperate, involuntary flailing of a profoundly exposed man whose physical body had completely and totally run out of ways to remain still in the blinding face of absolute historical exposure. His own loyal staff told him the grand promise was fundamentally false. They gave him the exact, devastating numbers, 5 to 8 million inevitable cancellations, and his immediate recorded response was to aggressively choose the high poll number over the fundamental truth. Vance did not stand up to physically loom over him. He did not pace aggressively around the room to draw attention. He stayed firmly anchored in his heavy chair, projecting not the slick, polished aura of a highly paid courtroom lawyer delivering a dramatic closing argument, but the raw, unvarnished, intensely authentic presence of a deeply betrayed kid from Middletown, Ohio, sitting across from the very president he had once fervently believed in and enthusiastically voted for. Mr. President, you are undeniably the greatest speaker of your entire generation, perhaps maybe of any generation in American history. When you talk, the entire world listens. When you pause, he gestured with a small, deeply subtle movement toward the suffocating, heavy air sitting between them. People wait with bated breath. When you say the powerful word hope, people genuinely believe it in their bones. That is a profound gift, a real, terrifying gift. And I grew up deeply listening to it. He paused, absolutely, not for theatrical effect, not to manipulate the cameras, but for raw, unfiltered, painful memory. Mama and I sat and watched your soaring speeches together on a cheap television with a broken, twisted antenna that you had to physically hold at a very certain, uncomfortable angle just to get a fuzzy picture. And after one of them, I don't exactly remember which one, but you were incredibly good in it. You were practically flawless in all of them. Mama slowly looked at the glowing screen and said something I have absolutely never forgotten. She said, "That man talks so unbelievably good, it makes you completely forget to check if he's actually telling the truth." He let the heavy ghost of Mama's cynical words sit heavily and accusingly on the table, directly beside the 7 shattered, broken promises and the damning classified White House memo. I finally checked, Mr. President, and what I painstakingly found is 7 massive promises, 7 distinct dates, and 7 undeniable lies. A frantic staff memo that explicitly told you the biggest one of all was entirely false. And a cold, calculated decision, your specific decision, made in your own Oval Office, heavily documented on your own official letterhead, to keep repeatedly saying it simply because it polled extremely well. You loudly promised hope. My town got flooded with heroin. You loudly promised change. The bustling factories slowly changed into sprawling, empty parking lots. You said, keep your trusted doctor. 5 million panicked people couldn't. You promised unprecedented transparency. You viciously prosecuted the very people who bravely tried to make you transparent. You swore no one would ever be left behind. 40 desperate veterans died rotting on a secret waiting list. He took a deep, ragged breath, the severe emotional toll of the confrontation finally bleeding into the permanent congressional record. Mama didn't live long enough to see this historic hearing, Mr. President. She died quietly in a rundown house in Middletown, Ohio, in a forgotten neighborhood. Your grand speeches frequently mentioned and your actual policies entirely forgot. But she fiercely told me something before she finally died. The one crucial thing she always told me, the absolute only piece of practical political advice Mama ever bothered to give. Watch exactly what they do, absolutely not what they say. Watch what they do. He slowly picked up his reading glasses from the towering stack of documents, folded them with a sharp, violent snap, and set them heavily on the table directly beside the memo, the small, violent, metallic click of the hinges carrying loudly and clearly in the absolute terrifying quiet of the sprawling room. I carefully watched exactly what you did, and what you ultimately did was give the greatest, most beautiful speeches in the entire history of American politics, and deliberately break absolutely every single promise hidden inside them. He folded his hands resolutely, a picture of absolute finality. That's all I have. When the stunned committee chairman finally offered President Barack Obama the floor to issue a rebuttal, the world-renowned architect of modern political rhetoric opened his mouth and completely faltered, deploying a heavy, agonizing pause that held absolutely nothing but the horrifying void of a man who had simply run out of words. Stripped of his impenetrable armor and staring into the relentless glare of the cameras, the legendary orator managed only 6 hollow, defeated words. I stand by the work we did, shattering his invincible aura in real time and unleashing a seismic political shockwave that instantly obliterated internet records with over 70 million views in mere days. The viral, unedited 16-minute clip became a psychological thriller for a deeply haunted nation, sparking an immediate, aggressive House oversight subpoena and causing terrified Democrats to publicly flee from their former champion, while the true human cost echoed hundreds of miles away in Akron, Ohio, where a heavily scarred combat veteran watched the agonizing footage alone in the dark, realizing with crushing certainty that the soaring hope he had voted for in 2008 had died somewhere during his 14-month nightmare on a secret VA waiting list. As the brutal dust settled on this historic congressional showdown, a quiet J.D. Vance sat anchored in the vice president's office, simply writing Memo was right on a yellow legal pad, completely at peace with the devastating truth he had just unleashed upon the world. Hundreds of miles away, isolated within the opulent, multi-million-dollar confines of his Martha's Vineyard estate, a paralyzed Obama sat frozen before a blank page, his legendary voice permanently silenced by the haunting realization that a forgotten grandmother's warning in Middletown, Ohio, had just irrevocably dismantled his entire legacy, leaving the undisputed greatest speaker of a generation staring helplessly into the terrifying, echoing black void of what catastrophic reckoning will inevitably happen next.